Hello and welcome to the Bradford Literature Festival, the digital programme, and welcome to our conversation today entitled How Do We Talk About Loss and Grief? My name is Lua Bairstow. I'm a celebrant and a live artist, and I'm really honoured to be hosting this conversation today where myself, Ellie Harrison, Khadijah Ibrahim, and Dr. Lucy Selman, who are fellow artists, practitioners and pioneers in the field of grief, will be exploring together how in a world that is hurting and damaged, do we begin to talk about grief and loss. But before I open today's conversation, I want to tell you a little bit more about my guests. So, Khadijah Ibrahim is a literary activist, theatre maker and published writer who combines interdisciplinary art forms to reimagine poetry as performance theatre. Her work appears in university journals and poetry anthologies such as Loss, published in 2019, and The Sea Needs No Ornaments, published in 2020. Dr. Lucy Selman is an Associate Professor of Palliative and End-of-Life Care at the University of Bristol. Her research focuses on people's experiences of serious illness, the end of life and bereavement, and how to improve care in these areas. Alongside Dr. Emily Harrop at Cardiff University, Lucy is currently leading a national study of bereavement during the COVID-19 pandemic in the UK. Motivated by her own experiences of grief, she founded the Good Grief Festival. The third festival ran between the 30th and the 31st of October in 2021 this year. And all the content from these three festivals and other Good Grief events is available on the Grief channel, grief-channel.com. And finally, Ellie Harrison. Ellie is an artist living in Leeds and working internationally. She is artistic director of the acclaimed Grief series, a sequence of 7 art projects that opens up spaces to talk about bereavement and end of life. Ellie specialises in embedding care, and participation is at the heart of all that Ellie does. So I'm just going to take a pause there. Ellie specialises in embedding care, and participation is at the heart of all of her work. As a performer, facilitator and mentor, Ellie lectures on her practice. She writes articles, gives talks, performances and workshops at universities internationally, including University of the Arts London, Sorbonne in Paris, UAM in Mexico City. So let's begin. So hello, welcome.
Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. I wanted to just open today's discussion with an invitation to share a few tips of how we might prepare ourselves for a conversation like this, a conversation about grief and loss. I know for me, I've got a gorgeous sunny jumper on. I've got a gorgeous blanket behind me. I got up early this morning because I've been really ill, and illness for me is really hard because my dad died of illness. So I really have to kind of summon the energy for something like this morning. So I went for a big walk and actually did a meditation. And I've got 3 cups in front of me. I've got a tea, I've got a hot water, and I've got a gorgeous glass of water. So that's how I've prepared for the chat this morning. Lucy, I wondered if you would tell us a bit about how you might prepare for a chat like this morning.
Well, I'm kind of wishing that I'd had the level of preparation that you've had, to be honest, Lua. That sounds great. I wish I'd gone out for a walk. I think for me, preparation for this kind of thing is probably trying to, is really mainly about sort of grounding myself and trusting. So trusting that my story and my words will come out as I want them to, and that what I want to say is already there. So my preparation has really just been being a mum this morning. So I've got 2 young kids. So I've been helping with them, and one of them is actually ill off school today. So I've been being a mum and had this in the back of my mind as well for the last few days. So it's an honour to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Lucy. Khadijah, I wonder if you could share with us how you might have prepared for this morning, or how you might prepare in your life,
well,
briefly stuff.
my morning ritual really consists of just trying to wake up most of the time. when I wake up, I say I'm awake, yeah, and not in the wake. So that's really important for me. Morning preparations of morning pages and affirmations are so important for me. It's a daily ritual. However, this morning I went to bed so late last night trying to finish some work that I did struggle to wake up and to be here. So I'm just saying, give thanks. I was able to make it to the desk, and I didn't have to leave the home because that would have been a little bit problematic. But having a cup of tea is really important for me, and it's not just regular tea; it's a herbal tea, fresh mint, or something like that to really wet the palate and start my day. But more than anything, it's just really daily affirmations of saying, thank you, I'm here, it's a new day, I can continue what I left the night before. And therefore, when I say wake up, it means to be awake and not in the wake of mourning loss.
Love that, Khadijah. I'm awake and not in the wake. Really love that. Thank you. Ellie, would you like to share?
Yeah, well, it's been really interesting hearing everybody with these beautiful, mindful morning rituals. I have none of that. I'm also noticing that I'm blending beautifully with my wall. I think for me, I have chronic fatigue, and so rest is really central to me, and also a sense of slowness. I think that society has a bit of a sense of hurry sickness, and we're always trying to do more faster. And so to go slow and look for moments of colour feels really important to me, and resist that temptation to speed up. So I've been squeezing in as much rest as I can possibly manage. And I have a bowl of coffee.
with a spoon.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good morning. So although I've prepared a series of questions as a framework for today, I really just would love this to be a conversation and just encourage us all to speak spontaneously, randomly, if we feel moved to do so. So how do we begin to talk about grief and loss in a world that is hurting and damaged? Lucy, I wonder if we could start off with you, and I wonder if you would be open to sharing with us about what might have been happening for you in your life that led you to create the Good Grief Festival. And I wonder, has the experience of that festival for you shifted, or does it shift your experience of grief today?
Yeah, great questions, and very big questions as well. Yeah. I suppose, I mean, like a lot of people, my life has been shaped by grief. So my father died when I was 15 of multiple myeloma, which is a rare form of leukemia. And it really did have a huge impact in that the sort of family dynamics and your sense of self and on all of those things really are affected when something like that happens to you. I think at any time, but maybe particularly at that age, 15, when you're sort of going through so much anyway. And one of the challenges there was that our parents chose not to tell us that he was going to die. So he had the disease for about 5 years. I can imagine for him it was so hard, having young children, being diagnosed. I was about 10, and they chose not to tell us, I think partly because they didn't know what was going to happen. And it was quite unpredictable. They didn't know how long he might have. But then obviously later, then being 15 and not being aware, that was really hard when he died, because it did make me think, are there things I might have done differently, if I'd been given that information. So I think probably that's one reason why I do the job I do, which is, work in academic research in end of life and bereavement. And then more recently, 3.5 years ago now, our second daughter, Ada, was stillborn. And it was really that experience of really profound and sudden, sort of unexpected loss, which motivated Good Grief Festival. So about a year after she died, I just thought I really want to try and do something to bring grief and bereavement more out into the open, and provide opportunities for people to reflect and think about grief and how it affects all of us. So it brought together both my professional interests in that I do research in that area, but also my personal experience and my personal motivation. And the fact that the pandemic then happened, because Good Grief was actually, first conceived of as a pre-pandemic event, and it was going to be a live event in Bristol. And then the pandemic happened, and we had to sort of transform it to an online event. I think what happened there was that there was such a need at that time. Sort of, we ran the first one in October 2020. And we were really in between two lockdowns. There'd been a huge number of deaths already. And I think grief and bereavement have been brought into kind of public conversation and consciousness in a way that they haven't for a really long time. So I think the fact we had so many people attend the first event was really because of that. And I think hopefully there has been a bit of a shift in terms of how we all as a society talk about or relate to grief and loss. At least that's one of my hopes, that might be a silver lining in this terrible situation we've been in.
Thank you, Lucy. I wonder if you could zoom in a little bit and talk about, from your observations, of the ways that you feel that the festival has changed, or that COVID-19 right now is changing the way that we're talking about grief and loss in practical terms.
There are some indications from some market research and other surveys that have been conducted that there are shifts in how people are thinking about grief and bereavement. So there was a survey that came out earlier this year that the Co-op Foundation ran, and they found that people were saying that they felt more compassionate towards bereaved people, and they felt more willing to talk about grief and loss. So I think that's one way in which the pandemic might have had some benefits. I think in terms of people who've actually experienced bereavement at this time, one of the really hardest things has been the separation and the sort of social isolation that people have felt because of all the infection related restrictions, like social distancing and the lockdown measures. So Good Grief, I think, provided an opportunity for people to come together online, despite the fact that they were experiencing physical, social isolation and being unable to hug their loved ones and things like that. So certainly in the Good Grief community, what we've seen in terms of feedback is a lot of people saying that the festival provided a sort of lifeline, that they could relate to people who were, had shared experiences. They could be part of a like-minded community from the safety of their home. So I think that's really been key. And I think one of the benefits might be that the pandemic has also kind of forced us to embrace digital technologies in a new way and think about communities maybe in a new way as well.
Totally agree, Lucy. I remember experiencing the Good Grief Festival in the pandemic, sat in my bed having a really griefy day. And I didn't even get out of my pajamas, and I was able to just cocoon myself in my bed with my little iPad and just zone out into the festival. So I really appreciated that it was digital and that I was hidden in that respect. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah,
that's great to hear. And I think, I was really worried about moving it online because, as I said, it was meant to be a live event. And I was just really worried about, would there be that sense of connection, and would there be that sense of sharing and kind of community if we moved it online? But actually, a lot of people did say I would have really struggled if it had been face to face. I wouldn't have been able to come, either because of the location or because emotionally it would have been too difficult to come with my grief and my pain and my suffering and sit in that very public space. So it certainly has had some sort of unexpected benefits maybe for all of us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lucy, and thanks for what you've shared this morning. Khadijah, I wonder if we could move to you. And I wonder if I could ask, delving into your work in preparation for this morning, I was really struck by how prolific your work is and your practice, but also how many ways your writing for me continually speaks about the complex nature of grief and loss. And I wonder if you could share with us what grief and loss might be meaning for you today and how that might be shaping what you're writing at the moment.
Right. So, in relation to looking at what's happening today, I really have to go back and think about why I started really interrogating what grief and loss meant for me as an individual. So, I lost my grandmother in 1999, and I was still going towards the end of doing my first degree at the University of Leeds, and she died at a time when I was entering into doing my exams, and I didn't think I would cope. But actually, I think what I did is that I kept that aspect of sadness inside of me and put it to the back of my mind and got on with what I had to do. And I realized that that sense of resilience was a thing of containing feelings that we're told that we're supposed to do. But I'd never really experienced loss in that sense. So I didn't really know what that really meant to me. So I kept it there for a long time. But what I realized what I was doing is writing it out, keeping journals, really trying to examine my emotional feelings of grief and what that meant to me. And it was at that point, and I'd lost a few friends before that as in a younger age, but I didn't know what that really meant in terms of grief. So just fast forwarding to really pushing those boundaries of examining what does it mean to lose a member of your family, a very close member of your family, someone that was part and parcel of raising me. You know, she was my mother as well as my grandmother, even though my mother raised me. And so I started to look at writing in different ways and looking at my Jamaican heritage and that richness. And so the first collection of poems, Another Crossing, examines aspects of grief. But what it does, it examines the wider context of loss and bereavement. So to the extent of not just losing a loved one, but losing a home, so moving from one location to another, losing friends, you know, the aspect of change. What does that mean? And so, reading the work of an amazing writer called Christina Sharp, who talks about being in the wake and blackness on the body, it really helped me to reshape my thinking of what loss really contains. So, moving forward in terms of my immediate research, which started back in 2017, to really go back and look at what did loss mean, what did bereavement mean, what were these funeral traditions that I didn't really understand that were happening and unfolding in front of me. The African Caribbean community of Leeds it's very large in its sense. It appears small and contained, but for me it feels very large. So when someone passes away, it's your friend's auntie, everybody goes to the funeral. It's your friend's grandmother, it's your friend's cousin. We all feel that sense of loss from that community. And there is a saying, there's a saying amongst the Caribbean community is that, well, I actually heard it from a family member, is that funerals are for the living who bury the dead. And with that, I wanted to unpick the meaning of what that meant. And so within my Jamaican heritage, I realized that the Jamaican culture continues to recreate itself within the richness of expression within the people, especially when it comes to rituals and beliefs concerning funeral practices. And so, hearing that statement, funerals are for the living who bury the dead, I understood that that meant that referred to burial rites. And it also referred to the fact that we have a saying, we bury our dead. And burying our dead is based on folklore traditions, which is part of an oral history that's steeped into the people's rituals of what does it mean to coexist with the living and the dead. And so a lot of my work really examines the living, the bereaved, the funeral rites, and the dead, and that each of these practices have an equal footing in understanding how we coexist with spirits. So that's really where my work has taken me, through the aspect of what I call dead and wake, that we are constantly looking at those processes of bereavement. And I think through the pandemic, what I realized is that Britain became a more compassionate country. Because at that point, I thought it was quite numb amongst some communities. So when you had to explain that somebody died and you have to go to a funeral, they'll say, "But didn't you go to a funeral last week, or didn't you go to one 2 weeks ago? Why are you still grieving? You know, at what point do we say we don't need to grieve anymore? Are we not allowed to grieve for weeks, for months, for years?" My grandmother died in 1999, and I feel like I'm always in this constant state of grief in remembrance. It doesn't go away, you know. So I use her as a reference point, for when I need to communicate something that's happening in my life. She's the first part of communication, whether it means I create the altar for her, where I go to the altar and I light a candle and I speak to her, and I feel like she communicates back. But having to have that dialogue with someone that maybe doesn't come from that cultural background or is not really in touch culturally with what grief can mean to other people, it becomes a difficult dialogue. But I think through the pandemic, because we were losing so many people at a rapid pace, I think the realization came to people that we can grieve. We can grieve openly. It doesn't have to be a secret affair. We can be very vocal about what that means. I know that within the Caribbean culture, it is very, very vocal, even down to the preparation of somebody, knowing that somebody may die and they know that they're at the end of life, that they will talk very openly about what those preparations should be. And we all enter as family, as community into that dialogue to ensure that that person gets the things that they requested, you know. And it's not about the expense of it, it's about the compassion that we have for the end of life for that person, that we're all part and parcel of that. And I think basically Britain has become, through the pandemic, a more compassionate, in its understanding that loss is something that we ought to talk about. We ought to have those dialogues openly, and that we can actually begin to unpick those practices, whether they're religious or spiritual, that we can begin to have an understanding of what grief and loss can mean to not just the individual, but to wider communities. So that's what my work really tries to engage in, that dialogue of what dead and wake, and being in the wake, and being in a constant aspect of being in the wake, and mapping and understanding what those ideas and concepts are when we're talking about the living and the dead and spirituality.
Thank you, Khadijah. So rich, and what you've said there, just taking that in. I think I've been really struck by the way that you've used the word contained a lot, being contained. And it made me think about a poem as containing a piece of your grief or your experience. And I just wanted to ask you, I wondered how it might feel when you've written a piece and you've contained something on the page, how it might feel for you to look at that, that relationship between it being something that's containing inside to containing on the page, how that space might feel for you once you've kind of named it or you've found a way of saying it.
Yeah, I think when I'm writing any poem, especially around grief, loss, burial rites, it almost feels like a release. So it's not contained within me, but it's out there, it's on the page, and then from the page, it's on the stage. It's there to share and really generate an extended conversation, and to allow maybe the reader and myself to be able to enter into a dialogue that really explores what those emotions are all about. So when I'm writing the poem, it depends on what I'm writing about at that time. So I remember in the anthology of Loss by Magna, when I was asked to write about loss. Now, loss is so extended, it could be the loss of anything, and automatically I went to bereavement and grief because that's where my mind is at. In fact, in all my commissions in the last from 2019 to present, when someone says we want to commission you to do something, that's where I go. I go into that bereavement and grief and see how I can actually really create a new poem of expression to talk about that. And so in 2019, I was actually in Cuba, and I'd lost my sister-in-law unexpectedly while I was in Cuba. And I'd spoken to her the day before, and I was traveling, I was in Havana, and I was getting ready to travel off to Santiago de Cuba. And I did that early that morning. And I arrived there, and then the next morning I heard that she passed away. And I didn't know what to do with that emotion of those feelings. And so I kept them. I kept them to myself for a period of time. And so when I was asked to write something around loss, I was struggling a little bit. I was looking at other things, but my heart and my mind was there about writing about the sister-in-law. And the reason why I wanted to do that is I really wanted to express at that time the differences in rituals. Because when our work becomes national or international, it comes from the local into the national um, experience. We begin to become more observant of traditions and ritual rites that we probably didn't observe before or didn't have the opportunity to be in the presence of what that may look like. And so, very much so, I've always attended funerals that come from my community, and that is what I know. Although I did attend a funeral many years ago in the early 90s from the Sikh community, and even then I was very intrigued with what those rituals were. And interestingly enough, I wrote and kept a journal about that experience and how that made me feel. So with the that ritual of writing and expressing self on the page, it's really about me interrogating the emotions of how I feel, but also how the wider community might feel at that time. And if that poem can give a sense of comfort, a sense of knowing, a sense of sharing, then that I feel like I've done something, an aspect of what I feel my job is, which is to really interrogate those rituals and those rites of passages and really broaden them for a wider community to really have the opportunity to come into acquaintance with not just the poem, but within their own feelings of how they may express loss and grief. So the poem for me is really about I guess unfolding those emotions and putting them on the page.
Thank you, Khadijah. Ellie, I wonder if we could move to you. And there's so much I want to ask you. We know each other quite well as two artists making live art about grief. So I really thought about this morning, and I wonder if someone whose art practice has directly impacted my own life and my own working relationship to grief. You've given me so many tools to work out how to use my living experience of grief, how to use that safely to make art with. And I'll never forget in you saying to me, in our practice, how do we travel safely to dangerous places? And it's not always easy. And I wondered if you could share with us this morning some of the ways that you might travel safely in your own life and in your own work.
Oh, that's really interesting. And I think interest in traveling safely in dangerous places has come from traveling unsafely or making mistakes in my in my life, really. So it's been wonderful hearing about Khadijah's experiences and thinking how different my early experiences were. So I was brought up by a single mum who was very, very stoic and very, very silent. And I think when she died, I'd never been to a funeral before, let alone organised one. And it was a really isolating experience. And I experienced a lot of what Khadijah was talking about, that numbness. And a lot of my peers hadn't necessarily had a major experience of bereavement. And so, yeah, I felt very on my own. And I suppose me and my sister took a very DIY approach to arranging mum's funeral. And I think actually we had beginner's luck because we didn't know what we were doing. We thought less about what we should do and more about what would celebrate her memory. And I think, I'm normally a bit hesitant to be proud of things, but I think actually we did a really good job for, clueless 17-year-old. I mean, the lilac dress was very bad. I made very bad outfit choices, but as a whole, I think it was, a good way of celebrating her. And I suppose I still hold that experience of feeling very isolated and exposed. And I've tried to think about how we might create spaces where we can listen. And yeah, I guess I've been making the grief series for a long time now. It sort of started by accident. I made a show about my experiences of losing people in my teens and my 20s. So I had quite a lot of bereavements very close together. I lost my mum and then my brother, and then I'd just begun to connect with my father, and then I lost him. And so I made a show about it. And I thought, oh, no one's going to want to see a one-woman show about grief. And I suppose, fortunately, they did. And what started happening was people coming up to me afterwards and sharing their stories. And it got to the point where the space after the show felt like the more important or as important as the art. But then I realized that the art was there as a prompt, as a way in, as a kind of emotional accessibility ramp into the subject matter, which felt important. And so I suppose in thinking about how we travel safely, sometimes there is something useful about having a shared focus that is outside of ourselves. So with the grief series, previous projects, we did a fun fair about anger called The Unfair, or we did a little museum in a caravan called Journey with Absent Friends. And it's about creating these little pockets of reflection and privacy in public space. So it's at one and the same time very, very public, but also feels quite held as well at the same time. And I think it's about creating spaces where we can bear witness and slow down. And for me, that feels like a radical act to say, I'm not going to look at my phone for the next half an hour. I'm just going to be with you and sit with these feelings. And so I suppose slowness and consent. I really think carefully about the ethics of participation and how to allow people to navigate talking about grief at whatever depth they want and feel safe for them. Because I think the reality is that grief, well, for me, grief doesn't stay still. It's different every day. And trying to wrestle it into some kind of order is a bit of a losing battle. I was talking to someone about how we don't try and control the sea. You know, some days it's rough, some days it's calm, and we take it for what it is. And I think I spent a lot of my early experiences of grief trying to wrestle the sea and losing really badly. So I suppose there's a sense to which the work that I make tries to encourage people to be in flow with their grief.
I love that, Ellie. And there's something you said there about the public and the private, and how your work seeks to practice that, how it seeks to practice that into that really tender intersection between talking about something really private in a public way. And it makes me think about the wider relationship to just the very nature of like this chat and talking about grief, how private that feels, how inside that is, how contained that is. And whoever you're talking to, whether it's someone you know really well, someone you've never met, a room full of strangers, that's really public. And there's something really beautiful there about the way you've built something that helps us practice that transition, which is really tender and really hard. Thank you for what you said. So much more I could ask all three of you, but I'm aware of the time. And I just want to open this space up to just unpick the orbit back and unpick the original question, which was how do we talk about loss and grief? And just I wanted to just hold some space for this last bit of our chat where we might want to just unpick that together and feed that in. We've all spoken, and there might be things that we want to pick up from what each other have said, but I wanted to just hold some space to just riff, basically.
I'd like to say something just following on from what Ellie just said. And I think both Khadijah and Ellie spoke so beautifully about their own experiences and how their artistic practice helps them move through that process and move with that process of grief. But one thing that really struck me was this idea of authenticity and vulnerability, and I think intimacy that comes when you're able to talk about your grief, which is a very private thing, but has the aspect of linking you to the whole of humanity and your community, because it's something everyone will experience. So it has this real kind of power. And Ellie kind of alluded to, you know, would people come and see my show? And yes, people do come and see the show, and they do want to read the poems, and they do want to come to a festival where they can hear people speak really authentically about grief, because it gives you that sense of connection to real life, you know, to the real life important things which we all deal with as human beings. And for a lot of people, you know, at Good Grief, we've had people say, I've never heard anyone talk openly about their grief. You know, this is the first time I've been, you know, my dad died however many years ago, and this is the first time I've heard two people talk about the death of their father openly. And there's such power in that. Like, it makes you feel, it can draw you out of that deep, deep well of isolation and loneliness and fear that comes from grief and loss. I think, you know, if you're able to bear witness, as Ellie said, bear witness to somebody else's grief and see yourself reflected back, it's really powerful.
It's made me think that also that everyone is their own expert on their grief, and how we encourage people to own that power and own the expertise that lives inside them already within that grief feels important. You know, like, I wish I'd had Khadijah's poems when I lost people, and also a sense of, with that individuality comes a sense of there being an emotional flexibility. Like, I use humor quite a lot in my work, and it's felt really central to me having conversations about grief that feel authentic, that don't feel like they narrowly must sit in the head cocked to one side, I'm sorry for your loss space. There's also space for play and joy and rage and railing and confusion and exhaustion. So yeah, trying to, like, open up the parameters of tone and what is allowed.
That's really interesting, Ellie, to say that. And in that sense of what I experienced through the African Caribbean community is that sense of there's grief and there's sadness, but also there's playfulness, there is song. So once somebody has passed, there are these 3 stages of preparation, and we have things like what we call the announcement of the death, which becomes what we call the setup. And the setup, or some people might say that is the wake, but the setup is about the community coming in for maybe 3 or 4 days into the home of the person and singing songs and reciting stories and having really great memories of what that person meant to them. And there's a sense they're there to cheer up the bereaved family. And it may appear strange outside of that community to other people, but that's really what it is. It's about that space of understanding and that aspect of how rituals are important within those communities, and that cheering up and that playfulness and that thing of song and singing and dancing and food being cooked, in that setup is about the family, but it's also about the deceased. And these rituals of sweeping the house, turning the mattress, preparation. And what that is also about is that the deceased will travel to the next life filled with enjoyment. They'll remember that the home that they've left, the family members that they have left, are in laughter and joy, and therefore their spirit can travel freely. Whereas if we don't do that, we feel like that deceased person will stay around, what we call the duppy. The duppy will stay around and cause a lot of havoc, and that's what we don't want. So that thing of play and song and dance becomes really part and parcel of that aspect of performance, because funerals are part of performance. That's how I look at them. There's stories to be told. And so we have this thing called the setup, and then we have the 9 nights of grief before the actual burial. So that is also a tradition held where we'll talk about the deceased, we'll have all these storytellings, but that's also part of the setup. And then after that, we have these things, what we call tracking and lining of the songs and the service before the person is laid to rest. And at that point, do we say, we have things such as fly away home, be at peace, all these aspects of do not return. And if your return comes, let it come back in peace. Let it come back because I call you back to do something peaceful and not in havoc. So there is this thing of play when we bring people in to do certain things. And I guess if you're a stranger to those traditions, you might say, these people in this home or in this space, in this church or wherever the ceremonies may take place, are not grieving. They're singing, they're dancing, they're laughing, they're drinking. The drinking of white rum is so important, the pouring of white rum to the ground. It may appear like that. At the end of any funeral, we have to say that was a good funeral, that was a beautiful send-off, and that is about speaking to the deceased. So I'm just thinking about those way markers in terms of how we mark grief and loss, and how part of that can be fun and excitement and laughter in a different way of how we think what fun and play and laughter can be.
Yeah, it makes me think, Khadijah, about my own experience of grief and talking about the complexity in grief in the rituals you were talking about there, and how much joy is contained in those rituals. I remember my sister once said, my dad died when I was 24. My sister once said, I'm really sad about how, because Dad's died, he stayed in this static place of, often we keep him on this pedestal, or he's in this static place where we're kind of thinking about him in this somber way, when actually he was full. That wasn't him. Sometimes that was him, but sometimes, like, being alive isn't just being sad, is it?
Yeah.
Or being in one state or one thing. It's chaos.
And it is that state, it's that state of knowing the person who's passed away, and those different levels of state of knowing, you know. So the state that wearing, which is why the saying is funerals are for the living who bury the dead, because we begin to think about our state, you know, of bereavement, of loss. But we also have to think about the deceased and the state that they're in terms of if we believe in a life after death or something other than just this place here, then it's about creating and making these preparations to send them off to this next life in a state of happiness. And so that is a way of the grieving family to hold on to some aspect of joy, of remembrance of the deceased. Um, you know, that's the concept and the idea of it.
It almost sounds, Khadijah, like what you're describing that you get from the rituals, or bereaved people can get from those rituals, is a bit like what Ellie was talking about in terms of that stretching out of the idea of what grief can be. Because I think one thing that people who haven't experienced a close bereavement, they sometimes feel like, oh, grieving is like depression, or grieving is like sadness, but actually it's so much more complex, isn't it? You have all of those different emotions all at the same time. And it sounds like some of those really beautiful rituals kind of give a framework and a space for people to feel that whole spectrum of different emotions that you have when you're grieving. Remembering all the amazing things about that person and giving thanks for that, but at the same time feeling, the fear or the confusion or the sadness or whatever happens to be that day, which changes all the time.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. For me, I sort of started to think about it more like a musical chord. Like happiness and sadness are not like two separate entities. They're things that are woven in different amounts into the same experience. So my happiest moments have some sadness in, and my saddest moments have more joy. And I guess like the joy ratio moves, but is sort of increasing. I'm now like at a place where I can really enjoy cooking something that my mum taught me how to cook, or there's more bandwidth for joy in there than there was right when it happened.
And it's those senses, you're talking about cooking. It's all those senses. I know when I sit, interestingly enough, as a child shopping with my grandmother in Leeds, when we'd go to the Leeds market, one of the treats afterwards would be fish and chips. And from that one particular fish and chip shop, which has now moved inside the market. And it's interesting for me because every time I go to that fish and chip shop, before they moved, that was grandma. That was my grandma. That smell of fish and chips is grandma. And when they moved location, it was a loss. I said to them, "Oh my God, you've moved location," and it feels really sad. And I started to explain to one of the women that worked in there about my grandmother. It just started, the smell unfolds a story, a narrative. The very fact of them just moving location felt like a loss because you've taken something. The smell is there and the fish and chips is still great, but almost like they've taken something from me by moving that location because I knew walking past there was grandmother, and just certain smells. My grandmother used to put things that she'd always have a preparation box or trunk for any occasion, so that she had a trunk for in case I have to go into the hospital. These are the hospital clothes. In case I'm traveling, this trunk is the traveling clothes, the underwear, and all these things. So each trunk had something in. So in case anything happened, she could go into these trunks and find these items very, very quickly and pack a bag. But whenever I would open the trunks, it would smell of camphor balls. I don't know if you know what camphor balls are. They're mothballs. they're mothballs, and it has a particular smell. Some people don't like that smell at all. But whenever I smell a camphor ball or a mothball, that's grandmother journeying, ready to journey somewhere. So that is the aspect of journeying when we extend that what journeying is. not just journeying to go somewhere to visit a friend or something's happened, she has to go to the hospital, but also journey extends in the Caribbean community, and I'm sure across other communities where we say that person, it's the end of life and they're journeying, and it's a different kind of conversation. So when my grandfather um, was dying at that time, and we knew that they gave him a week. He was with us for 3 or 4 other weeks on top of the week that they gave, but he was still journeying, and so the conversations changed. And he would always say, this morning I saw your grandmother, and what she was wearing, or the conversation would be he would go back to his Jamaica, even though he was in Leeds in the hospice. He was in his Jamaica and he was ready. And we knew that we had to do the things that he had requested. And in case you forget what it is, what this man did is that it's almost like, in case you forget what I've been talking about, here are 2 letters. So when he passed away, we had to go to the home, and there were these 2 letters. One was his life story that he typed out, originally on a typewriter, and then moved to a computer. So we got a sense of what his story was in terms of growing up and coming to England. And then the second one was a set of instructions of preparation, and who was to do what. And my job was to read a poem, you know, and it was so interesting because I was reading poems to him anyway, and he would say, "Read that poem." When I leave, read that poem. So those were the poems that I read for him. And he was very particular about not church, not being buried in the ground. So for us, those are really important things that we had to really support and total in terms of his requests. So it's just I was thinking about smells and requests and things that we touch and those senses that we carry that can spark memory.
That's absolutely right, Khadijah. How our experience of being in the world. I can't remember if it was Ellie or Lucy that said, I think it was Lucy, you said your dad died a long time ago. And yet the experience of that grief, because we're in the world and the sensation of being in the world, it's a continued relationship to grief, because that's what being alive in the world with grief is. It's sensation, it's smell, it's texture, it's weather. I'm just mindful of time, looking at the time, and I'd love us to, before we end today's conversation, I'd love to make some space, Khadijah, for a poem that you might have prepared on grief. Do you have something that you would like to share with us this morning?
Yeah, I thought that I would, since the biography mentions the anthology of loss by Magna, I thought I would actually read the poem from there.
Gorgeous.
Yeah, and I mentioned when I was commissioned to write something on loss, and I struggled. I went to that part where I knew that I'd just lost my sister-in-law. I was back in England, and I wanted to write about what that felt like and what was happening, but also to unpick those differences of what, being in Cuba as opposed to being in Leeds and burying a loved one. So this is called Day One Deliverance. That morning, April rain came, hurricane heavy with word of death. We, half awake, rolling last night's flecks of sleep out of dozy eyes, from a weary 17-hour bus drive to Santiago. We promised that day to swim in the saltiness of Santiago de Cuba's sea. But that morning she died, so we did not break fast. Our stomachs popped full of grief. We doused the ground with liquid morning communal cane juice rum, set up the deathbed to journey in disbelief. We blew smoke of Santeria Bianco rum dipped cigar to the sky spirits. It was gifted to us by a polished ebony, white-suited Orisha man. We danced all evening with him that day before that morning. The phone rang. Deliverance came, mournful, words unlike the sweetness of Santiago's canticles. We listened to the reggae root rock rhythms. We'll be forever loving Jah. Our psalms, we sat calm, head to head, Natty wrapped in the sadness of we bodies. He, a lonely blues beating boat out at sea. Me, a gentle wave rocked him back softly to the rhythm of grief. That morning, we cried, a measure of pain unknown. She's dead. She died. She, his sister, we in mourning, travelled that morning, all day and night, the long arm road from Santiago to Havana to bury the dead. The next morning, with no setup, 9-night ceremony or song, just we and our Father's prayers. Day 2, burial rites. Today she lay dead so, in a light blue canvas casket, cotton white burial dress, a slight silky soft cocoa brown smile, last cigarette burning ritual, coffee, limp flowers curled sad, in the sweat of Havana's heat, placed, dead rights, a space for the living. Cloudy bereaved eyes want to resurrect her back, to break the aching silence, her deadbed. But what a way they move so fast, crossing self at the threshold, sweep clean, fold away her belongings. Where is the calabash? Eshu, Oya, Oshun, priest, herbs, shells, and honeydew, water, to invoke her name, invoke spirit, invoke her, to pour her, sweet and tender, by the riverside. Instead, we lay her with 2 others in a tomb. No graveside hymns, no call and response. That day, we paused, sipped water in remembrance of her.
Thank you, all of you, this morning for being here and holding space to talk about grief and loss. So yeah, I just wanted to say a big thank you and to go into the day with care and to stay connected and warm.
Thank you, Lua. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Ellie.
Thank you all. It was great to talk to you all.
Bye, everyone.